find such a love at our age. Whoever thought we could dance on a thrilling... Welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I'm your co-host, Judy Alexander, and I'm here with my husband, Dr. Bruce Chalmer.
Hello, Judy. Hello, viewers and listeners. Judy, what's today's title?
From Near Divorce to a Thriving Marriage, an interview with Sophie Orozco.
Yes, indeed. And you know, folks, if you would like an infusion of faith and hope and possibility, stay tuned, because that was certainly what I took from our interview.
Absolutely.
In case you haven't figured it out, we just did the interview. That's why I know that already. And so in just a few moments, we will be getting to that. First, we want to put in our usual plugs for our usual books.
Absolutely.
I think we can be fairly brief about it, but by golly, let's plug our books.
Well, Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again.
And that one is so relevant to what we were talking with Sophie about.
Yes,
and it did come up in our conversation briefly.
Yes, it is.
And it was sort of neat. Actually, after we got done recording, I said, I'm going to send her my books. I mean, she asked about them. And this is a bit egotistical on my part to say, but it's like she read my books, or you could say it's like I worked with her,
you
writing
could
my books.
Say that.
We were saying very similar things in our own respective ways.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, this book, Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back, this book actually came up in the conversation because the whole idea of reigniting a spark and how to bring intimacy back into your lives, and that's certainly something that Sophie works on with her clients. So if you're getting to that spot in your relationship, good book to read.
Absolutely. And I just want to note the key there, and this is what came up in our conversation, you'll see in the interview, the key there is recognizing it's possible. So many people feel like, oh, the spark is gone, you can't get that back. That only happens early on. No, it's not true. It is possible. It doesn't always happen, but it often does. And anyway, so you'll see that in the interview. Possibilities. And
another topic that came up, it's not about communication. Why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong.
Absolutely. So you can check out those books anywhere books are sold. And one of the most popular formats on all of those books is the audio format, which is available. And I did the narration. And we have another book that we want to tell everybody about.
Yes, and which is also really nice to have on audio, The Blue Tent, Erotic Tales from the Bible by Laria Zilber, also narrated by me.
Yes, also written by you.
Oh, well, there's that.
Because you're a Laria. We don't have to be coy about that anymore, do we?
Don't. No, we don't.
And in your beautiful narration. And, speaking of reigniting the spark, now, of course, that's it's a leap in some ways, in that people, to be willing to enjoy your book together, have to already be at that point where they're wanting to be in the same place at the same time in rather intimate ways with each other, and then they will greatly enjoy your book. That's another way of reigniting and fanning the spark once it's going. And I highly recommend it from personal experience, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
And so on that note, let's go to our interview, and we will see you on the other side.
Our guest today is Sophie Orozco. Sophie is a relationship coach, wife, and mother of 4 children. As Sophie describes it, she was hanging on by a thread when her husband said he wanted a divorce. That's when she turned her lifelong interest in relationships into urgent action to save and improve her own marriage. She applied what she learned to help women have healthy and thriving marriages. Sophie blends the practical, psychological, and spiritual aspects of relationships together to help her clients turn cold and hostile marriages into fulfilling partnerships. Sophie, welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you. So we always like to ask our guests as our first question, how did you get into the work you do? Tell us something about your own journey.
Yeah, so really it's from my personal experience. My marriage fell apart when my 4th baby was born. Just like the intro that you shared, I was completely devastated, and I had always had an interest in relationships and just relationship dynamics for a really long time. And so when my husband said that he wanted a divorce, I I went to a couple of therapists who told me that my marriage was over. There was nothing I could do.
Mm.
And I said, I thought there's got to be something that I can do. So I really just went to town trying to figure it out. I read every single book. I hired a ton of coaches. I did all the courses, and I really learned what makes a relationship work and what doesn't, and how much I had actually been doing wrong to create the relationship breakdown. Obviously, it wasn't all my fault, but it was definitely 50% my fault. And so, taking that accountability and that responsibility, I just slowly started to implement the things that I was learning. And I completely turned my relationship around. It's actually much better today than it was even when we met or when we got married.
Mm.
And then I thought, well, why doesn't more people know that? Like, why don't more people know this? And so many of my friends, like, I was kind of hitting that time where people were starting to get divorced. Like, I wasn't going to weddings anymore, but my friends that had been married were starting to get divorces. And I thought, like, I need to start sharing the knowledge that I've learned. And so that's how I got into it. Yeah.
So were you totally blindsided when your husband asked you for the divorce? Or were things like,
Well,
and
yeah, I mean, I like to think I was blindsided, but if I was honest, no, I mean, things
Mm.
had been really bad for a long time. And that's kind of what I tell my clients that say, "Oh, I was blindsided." I'm like, "No, you just weren't paying attention,"
Mhm.
yeah.
because there was like my husband had been trying to tell me, but I hadn't been listening,
Mm.
and I'd been getting super defensive when he had been bringing his thoughts and feelings to me, and I
Mhm.
wasn't listening.
Mhm.
So.
That it's so interesting how you describe, you know, I'm of the two of us, I'm a therapist, as we like to say, I'm a therapist and Judy's the real person, you know. Judy is an educator and retired
Yeah.
educator, but it's so interesting as you describe, you know, you went to therapists and they were telling you, oh, forget it, your marriage is over. And
Hmm.
I've noted, and you know, I've told you this for years. You know, I've been doing this, working with couples for like 30 years now. I realized
Hmm.
very early on, not even to bother in my own mind making predictions about how things were going to go, because my
Hmm.
predictions were so often simply wrong, because you just
Mm.
can't tell, which is interesting. And you know that aspect of having some faith that it perhaps is possible that things will turn around. You know, I've seen it
Hmm.
happen. Doesn't always happen, but it does
Mm.
happen sometimes. And so that, you know, the fact that you went to a therapist and they were basically, you know, pronouncing death on your relationship, and you had well, I guess how would you describe it? It sounds like you had enough faith or determination or something to decide, well, you're not going to listen to that nonsense. I mean, how did you know?
Yeah.
Or, you know, what were your thoughts?
Yeah. So it was interesting because what had happened was my younger sister had just died of cancer when my
Oh my.
husband told me that he wanted a divorce. And
Mm.
Mm.
it was heartbreaking. But leading up to that, I'd had a really difficult relationship with my younger sister. And when she got diagnosed with cancer, I was like, I had this strong sense that I wanted to reconcile my relationship with my sister so that when she passed away, I didn't want to feel any complicated grief that I'd had with my dad, who died when I was in my early 20s. It took me years to get over my dad's death. And so because I had young children, I was really like, okay, I want to see if I can like get to the bottom of my relationship with my sister and come to peace with that while she's still alive. And so I did amazing work reconciling my relationship with my sister. And it wasn't easy. But when she died, I was at so much peace. And I really felt like, wow, like my relationship with her completely turned around. And
Mm.
so when my husband then came and said, I want a divorce, I was like, okay, I've done this in one relationship. I think I can do this with my marriage. And
Wow.
I had like a strong realization that like I had also experienced breakups in other relationships that felt very similar to this breakup. Like I'd gotten further in this relationship, I'd gotten married and had kids, but still I was experiencing some similar patterns. And so I started to think maybe the common denominator here is me. And this is an opportunity for me to heal my relationship patterns,
Mm.
which is what gave me like the fuel. I was like, no matter what, like I want to figure this out because I don't want to keep doing this in my
Uh,
Hmm.
relationships.
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're describing some aspects of things. My most recent book is Betrayal and Forgiveness. It's all about, you know,
Mm,
among other things, the possibility of reconciliation,
yeah.
and how people can possibly get there. And you're
Hmm.
describing, I think, a couple of really, you said several interesting things in there that I just want to call attention to. One thing you noted was your relationship after you did all this work, primarily on yourself, your relationship is
Hmm.
better than it even was before.
Yeah.
And that's something I always like to point out that, if a marriage is going to heal from some kind of breach, pretty
Hmm.
much the only way it heals is that it gets better than it was before, because how it was before is what led up to the breach.
Right.
And so I'm
Hmm.
curious how you did that. And the other thing I'll just note, and I sort of noted it earlier, it was your determination, that you were willing
Yeah.
to recognize, find some power that you didn't realize you had to make a difference and
Hmm.
then work on that. And that's impressive too. But I'm curious,
Hmm.
how'd you pull that off?
Well, I think at first it was the determination, because I was hearing from all sides, it's not possible. Um, he says he doesn't love you anymore, so it's over. And I just was like, I felt this strong conviction that I could save this. And so I was really on the hunt for like anyone that could give me any shred of information that could give me some insight as to what to do next. And I just kind of went step by step, like gathering more and more like information that was helping me on the journey. And I was very clear about my destination, that this was possible and that I could do this. And I also had that feeling of like the marriage that I was currently in was over because it hadn't worked. And the same thing, like you talk about that betrayal, I definitely encountered the betrayal in that time in my marriage as well. And so I had to just let everything go and really start to see my husband for everything that he was going through too. And leading up to that, I had been so like, he's this, he's that. Like I couldn't see his perspective.
Hmm.
But the breakdown really helped me to see that he was hurting, and the way that he was expressing it was not it was very hard for my ego to manage,
Sure.
but that he was an individual too with hopes and needs and wants and desires, and that he wasn't intentionally doing it to me, he was doing it for himself. um and that I had to let go of like the previous relationship and start to build a new relationship up from the ground up, really.
So when you said that you wanted to work on the marriage, was he open
Yeah.
to that idea, or did it take a lot of convincing on your part that said, no, I really want to make this work and how can we do it? Like how did that go?
Yeah. So he wasn't open to working on the
Hmm.
marriage. He said he wanted to leave. He did in fact move out partially, but we had young kids, so he would come back for half the week. But he was very certain that it was over for him and that he didn't have any feelings for me and that it wasn't going to work and that he couldn't see a way through. Um, and I didn't convince him because I had tried that and it didn't work and it almost created more resistance. And
Usually
so
does, right? It makes sense.
yeah,
Because,
yeah,
yeah, that insight you had, that, wait a second, he's a separate person with his own, please keep going, but I'm really curious, how did you manage to pull that off in yourself, to recognize that?
hmm
Because that's a tough thing for
That is
people
a
to
tough thing.
recognize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
hmm
But yeah,
yeah.
please
I
go
just
on.
had this moment of like surrender. I was like, I can't keep him here against his will. I'd been trying. He'd been telling me he wanted to leave, that it was over. And so I just had this moment where I was like, I can't keep him. And so I did. I said to him, listen, I love you. I want to make the marriage work, but I know I can't keep you here against your will. So if you want to leave, I'm definitely not going to come over and decorate your apartment for you. I remember saying that. I was like, I'm not going to go to IKEA. I'm not going to buy you any lamps, but if you want to go, I can't keep you here. Like, I love you. I'm going to prove to you that I want the marriage to work. But if you need to go, go. Um, and that was almost like the starting point, I think, to rebuild because he saw that I wasn't just out for myself at that point,
Mhm.
that I actually did see him as an individual because he'd felt so unseen in the years leading up to that. I'd had a lot of children very quickly. There was work. My sister had been dying. I was super focused on that relationship, and he felt like he didn't matter in the whole sea of life.
Mm.
And when I said, like, you can go, I can see how you feel this way, and I took some responsibility for my actions, it was like the starting point to really turning things around.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a big leap on your part.
Yeah, it was hard.
Yeah. Yeah, that
Yeah.
and that recognition of your, I mean, your own validity, but his validity also.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah.
often the hard stuff. I have a term for that moment, actually, one of my favorite terms. I call it the oh shit moment. And what I mean by the oh shit moment, it's not the oh shit when you hit your thumb with a hammer, not that one. It's the
Yeah.
oh shit, no wonder this is happening. It's like, oh,
hmm
he's got valid concerns. So do I.
Yeah.
Oh shit, no wonder, you know. And I call it that rather
hmm
than the aha moment because it doesn't necessarily solve things, but it sets you
Right.
up so that maybe you can solve things.
Yeah. Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
how
Yeah.
did it develop then? So you had this insight and you know you stopped fighting with him.
I
And
did.
so he
Yeah.
did move out partially, it sounds like. How
hmm
did things develop from there?
Well, I started to realize that like what had happened was our relationship had been like on a downhill slope, and we'd been fighting a lot. There wasn't like much connection, much friendship between us. And so I realized that it was going to be very small and that I was going to slowly have to work up in the connection with him. And it wasn't going to be a sudden reconciliation. So I was really like, I'm going to give this a year. Like I really said to myself, I'm going to give this a year from now until a year from now. I put the date in my calendar and I
Mm,
said, if we're not back together by that, then I'm going to move on and sell the house and do whatever I'm going to do. But I'm going to give it a year. And so day by day, I just really started showing up differently. And it was really simple to begin with. I would just like smile when I saw him. And I remember I kind of turned it into a game. And I was like, because he was looking at me like he wanted to kill me. Like when he saw me,
mhm,
it was like cold, like. And so I just thought, I wonder how long it will take for him to smile back at me if I start smiling at him.
mhm,
And in the beginning, I felt like super weird. And then I remember after about like 3 or 4 months, he was like on the lawnmower one day and I smiled at him and he smiled back at me. And I was like, yes, it worked.
mhm.
And that just showed me like very simply, but it showed me the power of like, if I do this, then he'll do this, right? I guess the law of cause and effect, right?
Mhm.
And and it gave me that like momentum to keep going.
Yeah,
And so it was just like that every day, like making a positive connection with him.
yeah.
Because
Mm-hmm.
we'd been fighting so much and every interaction we'd had been so negative.
Yeah.
That
And
you know
so,
the first part of that, as you described it, was declining to participate in the narrative that you're fighting. Do you know what I mean?
mhm.
What who is was it Carl Sandburg or somebody who coined the expression, you know, someday they're going to give a war and no one will come? You know, it's like you
Yeah,
refuse to come to the war. You know, it's like,
yeah,
oh, you're angry with me. You think we're fighting, and you
hmm
would just smile because you were not fighting anymore.
yeah,
And you couldn't
and
fake that. You're right. That you had to actually believe that.
Yeah. And
yeah,
a lot of
yeah,
patience and willpower on your account to get through all that. I mean, 3, 4 months, that's a long time.
yeah. It was, and it was really hard just to keep going when you weren't seeing much like evidence on the outside that things were actually changing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in the beginning, I was even just like pretty quiet a lot of the time because I couldn't think of like what to say because we'd been in such a negative like conversation pattern and everything had been like complaining or we weren't happy and I wasn't happy, definitely, because I'd had, 4 kids in 5 years and I kind of
Wow.
lost myself during that time. And I still had little baby and 4 kids that were under the age of 6 years old.
Yeah.
So I had
That's
to
pretty
find ways.
stressful right there.
Yeah, it was lonely and stressful. And I had to find ways to kind of fill up my cups so that I could smile at him when he came home. And um, yeah, and in the beginning, it's like it would have been easy for me just to be mad at him and yell at him, how could you do this to me? How could you, but I didn't do any of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then just slowly over time, we started to become friends. And then the friendship got stronger, and then we started to laugh about things. And I would like push myself out of my comfort zone if I saw something funny or the kids did something funny, to like contact him and share the funny story. And it just started like that, and just the snowball kind of got bigger and bigger.
Mm.
And then we would go out for dinner every once in a while, and we'd have fun. And the interactions between us became more positive. And then I started to like flirt with him more. Like when we got to a certain level, it was like then we were flirting, and
So
it.
you're making him, you're prioritizing him again in your life.
Yeah, and really like deciding that I was going to love him, even though he wasn't behaving in the way that I wanted him to at that moment.
Yeah. Was he
You
seeing
know?
someone else anywhere along the way? I, I would
Yeah,
imagine he was. I mean,
I mean,
that
just
would
like
yeah,
you've
typically,
been saying.
yeah, yeah.
yeah. And I didn't find that out for about 6 months.
Uh,
And like obviously my friends that kind of knew about the situation would say like, of course this is happening. And I had said to them, yeah, it might be, but that's not going to help me right now, because
mhm,
that's not what I want to focus on.
Oh,
yeah.
good for
Because
you.
actually I really want to save my marriage here.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And so when it did come out that that was going on, I was so far down the line, and I'd seen so much positive growth, that I was absolutely devastated and heartbroken. But I also said to my husband, I can see how we got here. I'm really heartbroken, but I don't blame you for it. And it doesn't change how I feel.
Mm, yeah.
And it actually, once I found out, actually sped things up. And quite quickly, things got back on track after that,
Mhm.
because
Oh,
there was no hiding anymore, you know?
uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I'm also imagining there are couples that I've seen, that I've worked with, and who have actually ended up splitting up, who repair their relationship not to become a couple again, but repair the relationship as parents, as co-parents, things
Mm-hmm.
like that, even in the presence of other partners who do.
Mm.
It's a fairly similar, seems to me a fairly similar process to what you described, without the getting back together as lovers part. Do you know
Yeah.
that they actually repair their relationship as warmly connected as parents of the same children, but also
Mm-hmm.
accept that, well, the part of their relationship that was being a married couple may be over, and they're
Yeah.
not having sex with each other. They may be having sex with other people, but
Mm-hmm.
they can still be warm toward each other. And
Yeah.
of course, in theory, that's what could have happened for you. So that,
Mm.
of course, is not what
Yeah.
you wanted.
Yeah. Yeah. That could have happened. Although, like, I was pretty certain that that wasn't going to happen.
Uh-huh.
I was
You
pretty
sound
set.
pretty
I was like,
determined.
that's not, yeah, I was like, that's not the route that this is taking.
Yeah,
Hmm.
But
yeah,
with my clients who come in that sort of situation, I will say to them, like, no matter what, you will end up having a better relationship with
yes,
him,
yeah,
and like that's going to serve you in the long term, because you're going to be dancing with this guy at your daughter's 18th wedding, like, not 18th, but you know what I'm saying? Like when
yeah,
she's married, like
Hmm.
you're going to be dancing at the wedding. You're going to have a relationship with this person for the rest of your life if you've got children, or at least until she's 18. I think that's where I was going with it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it behooves you to form that relationship, because I think our egos get so bruised when we get rejected by, somebody, that
Hmm.
we want to just lash out and retaliate and react from that space. But
So how
yeah.
do you work with the folks you work with? I mean, sort of like, I mean, that's a very general question, but how do you work with your clients?
I work with mostly women, and I have a program called Relationship Miracle Method, which is like a 12-week process that I take women through. And sometimes they stay longer. We work one-on-one, and I also have a group of women. Um, and I have videos and modules and all that stuff. And basically, I take them on like a very similar process to kind of what I went through, but I like condense it. So firstly, we really look at like what are their deep core beliefs about relationships? What did they see modeled when they were growing up? What are their beliefs about themselves? Um, and how are they taking care of themselves? Like how are they on the day to day? Because like most of my clients are women with young kids, and they have completely abandoned themselves.
Mm.
and put all of the focus on the kids and then
Mhm.
looking to their husband to make them happy. But because they're not actually taking care of their happiness, nothing that he does is helping them.
Hmm.
So I teach them to take responsibility for their happiness essentially and start to rebuild that part of them and to rebuild their self confidence. We also clear it, like really do like resentment clearing, go into their resentment, forgiveness, and then I teach them like communication skills and strategies.
Can you speak more about that, like the clearing resentment? Because I say it's a big part of what I've written about. I'm curious, how do you approach that?
Yeah, so I use a process very similar to like what a 12-step program,
Ah,
um, where you go through your resentments and you look at like what's the story that you have and what part have you been playing to keep that story alive?
hmm.
Because when you like pull apart the resentment, you can see that like you put yourself kind of in that victim place and you're getting something from being the victim. Like your ego is getting some sort of a reward from keeping yourself in the victim place of the resentment story. So it's really just like pulling it apart and examining it and seeing what part that you can take responsibility for your actual resentment.
Hmm.
Now, do both parties, well, it didn't happen in your case where where both of you wanted to save your marriage, but how do you work with a couple or a woman whose marriage is breaking up and let's say the husband is really intransigent and he wants no part of reconciling? Is
Mm-hmm.
it possible to save that marriage, do you think? Or have you seen that or what happens?
Yeah, I see it all the time. I see it all the time because basically what I kind of break down is like the reason that he doesn't want to be part of the marriage right now is because he's felt super unsuccessful in the marriage leading up until now. And it's
Mhm.
just like that pain pleasure principle. Like it's too painful. There's no benefits to being in the marriage. Usually what I see is that the husband's been trying to make the woman happy and it hasn't been working. And so he feels that he cannot solve the problem anymore. So the best solution to make everybody happy and solve the problem is to go your separate ways. And that when he feels that he's making her happy, that she's happy, that they're having positive interactions and he's feeling good in her presence, then he has buy-in like, oh, okay, maybe I can see that things could be different.
Mm.
And that's all you need is like a small like opening or a small light bulb to go off for him to be like, okay, maybe. And that's usually when he'll get on board. And a lot of progress can be made just by the woman starting to do the work of changing the way that she shows up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how you describe, from a male perspective, that sense that, when we are feeling well, unsuccessful, that sense of failure is certainly that's really painful. And particularly that sense that most of us, I've met guys where this isn't true, but I think most of us
Mm-hmm.
actually do want to please our wives. And
Mhm.
we feel
Mm-hmm.
that sense of, it feels really fulfilling when she's smiling. That
Yeah.
story you told about you just smiled at him. And
Mm-hmm.
after a while, he couldn't resist it.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, that's kind of what we're after. And, it
Mm-hmm.
is where he was at. It's so interesting how well you seem to understand him, where he was at.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't smiling at you for all that time because he was just feeling hopeless about it. He couldn't
Mm-hmm.
possibly feel that he could be successful in that way. And we really are motivated by that feeling of success when, I'll often say, I love to put a smile on your face because it's really
Mm-hmm.
rewarding,
Mhm.
it's very
Mhm.
reinforcing.
Yeah. Yeah, and even that story about my husband and him smiling back to me, we had ended up having a conversation about that later in the day, and he said, you know, you started smiling, and like I haven't seen you smile for years,
Ah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
and I hadn't even realized I wasn't smiling, but of course, like I was miserable, so of course I
hmm,
Yeah.
wasn't smiling.
yeah, yeah. That's what you were saying
Yeah.
about, when Judy was asking you about were you blindsided, and it's an interesting sort of paradox. You weren't blindsided with hindsight.
Yeah.
But you didn't know it, so I guess you were blindsided. You didn't
Yeah.
know it till you knew it. But once you knew it, then you look back and say, "Oh my God, I've been miserable for years." That's not the
Yeah.
story you were telling yourself. but then you
Yeah.
realize the truth in it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I thought if only he does this, then I won't be so miserable.
Mm,
That was kind
yes.
of where I'd been at for a while.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Everybody tries to solve things and, looking to the other person.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I just had a client who I spoke with yesterday, actually, and she did 6 weeks with me. And when she first came in, she was like, "Yeah, but he's saying that he doesn't think he loves me, and da 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 da, and it's definitely over." And I said, I hear you, but I think we can do something about this. And literally 6 weeks. And I spoke to her yesterday, and he booked a holiday. They're in England. He booked a vacation for for them next week, and he's been buying her flowers. It's like
Oh,
completely changed
Yeah.
just by her changing how she is around him.
Hmm.
Like listening to him, like validating him, and like smiling, and just these really simple things. And he's like buying her flowers and taking her on holiday. And this is a guy who, like, 6 weeks ago, she said, he doesn't love me, he doesn't want to be with me, he
Mm.
doesn't see a future. And it's like, wow,
This
in
is
6 weeks.
akin to something I know we were noting when looking at some of your materials, and you were saying one of the questions you'll often deal with is, what about when your partner says, "I love you, but I'm not in love with you anymore"?
Oh yeah, it's my
Sounds
favorite.
similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. How do you handle that one? I hear that one a lot too. What do you
Yeah.
what do you do with that one?
Yeah, and I think that it's such a broad term that people would just use when they're just not feeling that spark. They're not
Yeah.
feeling connected. They're not feeling like excited. They don't really feel a future. And so they'll
Hmm.
say that, but actually, like, that spark can be turned back on pretty easily.
Hmm.
yeah.
And then when you hear it, like, "I'm not in love with you," it feels like, "Oh my gosh, it's the end. It's the end." And like everyone will like agree, "Oh my gosh, if he's not in love with you, it's got
Yeah.
to be over." But it's like, no, no, you can bring that back. Just
Yeah.
walk
People
around the
think
house.
it's a status that doesn't, it's like, oh, we're over that phase and you can't get it back. I mean, the book
Hmm.
that you like to call it, the book that started this podcast,
Right.
was one I wrote a few years ago called Reigniting the Spark. It's all about
Okay.
that concept, but you have to
I want
have
to read
the,
that.
yeah, oh, absolutely. You have to have the belief that it's possible. Is sort
Hmm.
of, you have to start with that understanding. It's like, oh, just because someone's saying they're not in love with you anymore doesn't mean that can't change. It turns out to
Hmm.
be very changeable.
And that's your the seventh word, have faith.
Yeah, the faith part is that this whole life business is livable.
Hmm.
And so, and
Hmm.
again, I think that's what you were embodying, because the story you have told, I think I'm sure a lot of your clients and a lot of the folks watching this will find it very inspiring. It is a really
Hmm.
inspiring story. And I just like to note, and I was sort of mentioning this earlier, it might have turned out that you, like you said, it might have turned out that you wouldn't have stayed together, but you still would have had
Hmm.
a better relationship. It still would have been an expression of faith in yourself, in the
Hmm.
world, in life in general, that you can
Hmm.
make this better. You don't have to accept that it's just miserable. You don't have to stay in the
Hmm.
victim stance.
Right.
And even if it hadn't
Exactly.
turned out that you'd stay together, and again, that's got to be true for some of the folks you work with, even if you don't stay together,
Hmm.
you can make your life, you can do what you can do, and that turns out to be a good thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And I really wanted to, like I said, I'd had that experience with my sister where when she died, I felt like my side of the street was completely clean, that there
Yeah.
was
Hmm.
nothing else that I could have done to feel at peace with the way that we left our relationship. And so I wanted that feeling with my husband. Like, I wanted to know that if we ended up getting a divorce, that I had done everything in my power to turn things around, and it wasn't on me. And
Hmm.
that was like one of my big motivating factors for it as well.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
But yeah, that faith is
Good.
so important. And I
You
think the
had
willingness to take new action, like what you were just saying about the spark being gone. I find that a lot of my clients are like, "Yeah, but it's so awkward now to like flirt
hmm
with him because we haven't done that in like 10 years."
Hmm.
And I'm like, "Yes, but you've got to, if you start to do this flirting or whatever it is that we do, right? Like the things that I help my clients to do, like if you start to do this action, you will start to get a different response. And
Hmm.
that's how the new feelings will come back. but you have to get a little bit uncomfortable because you guys like being super comfortable is what's gotten you into this position in the first
Yes.
place, you know?
That was kind of what my main thesis, I think, in that book, Reigniting the Spark, is, and I didn't make up this concept, but what stable couples will tend to do is avoid that discomfort. And
Mm-hmm.
in doing so, they're actually avoiding intimacy. They're afraid
Mm-hmm.
to say how they
100%.
feel. They're afraid to bring up something that might raise anxiety. And so
Mm-hmm.
intimacy wanes and you end up in that situation. And so it always
Mm-hmm.
involves, that's one of my favorite little dicta. You've heard this a million times. The chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety. And
Yeah.
that's what you're describing.
And
Yeah, you have
also
to
in
lean
your
in.
relationships with both your sister and your husband, sounds like you really had to sublimate your ego and take that responsibility and say, I can't put the blame on other people. I really need to examine my own complicity in all this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I started to really look at this as like opportunity for self-development and growth.
Hmm.
And that when it was uncomfortable, that was like I would lean into that rather than lean out because I knew that when it was uncomfortable, that was something that I could step into. And really, like, what I found is that a lot of people who are like disconnected from intimacy, like they've been avoiding it, shutting down, but it's that one thing that they actually really crave, but it's so scary to open themselves up to it.
Yeah,
So,
Yeah.
like you said, that tolerating of anxiety. Yeah. And to get used to being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember some anthropologist or other. I don't think it was Helen Fisher, but some anthropologist was describing in evolutionary terms where did monogamy come from? Why does our species do monogamy the way we do it? And we don't do it
Hmm.
perfectly, but we mostly do it. And one of the theories was actually it's mostly about forcing people into growth. It
Hmm.
forces you to face some of those anxieties in ways that nothing else does. If you attach yourself to one person and then you bump into the fact that that can cause anxiety, in fact, it's going to cause
Hmm.
anxiety, that actually has been a developmental push in our species, and we get better at all sorts of things.
Mm.
So it's one of
Yeah.
the theories
Yeah.
I've read about.
Yeah. I think that, like, your relationships, in my experience, my relationships have been my biggest teachers and my biggest growth opportunities and the
Mhm.
most spiritual, like, assignments that I've ever had to undertake. Um, and I think it really can be. And I say to like clients that I come in and work with, like, your marriage crisis is a massive opportunity for you
Yeah.
to heal things that you didn't even know that you had going
Hmm.
on, you know?
So true.
Yeah. Yeah, that spiritual sense I find really compelling. There's something, it's spiritual in that sense of it's much bigger than all of us. It's not
Yeah.
just about us. One of the things I pointed out in terms of marriage, for example, as opposed to merely living together, merely having life together, and I'm not trivializing those things, but marriage itself, why should anybody bother getting married anymore? Well, one reason I would say is because it elevates it out of it's when you get married, you're basic, and this is true even in secular marriages. You're basically saying this is more than just us. We're doing this
Hmm.
publicly. We're saying, you know what? Now the state has skin in the game, like it or not.
Yeah.
And in religious terms, I mean, we're Jewish, and you get married under a chuppah, on a
Hmm.
canopy, and it's open-sided, and the symbolism there is okay. Now everybody's got a piece of us. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's not just
Yeah.
us anymore. If we have a fight, the whole community is going to be upset. You know,
Yeah.
certainly if we split up, and like it or not, everybody's got a piece of you. That's a spiritual sense. That's something that says, oh, this isn't just about us. Even though
Yeah.
our individual love is very important to us as individuals, and there's something again I find very spiritually important about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think you have to choose, like, and that was kind of what one of the hardest things for me was like to choose to be loving and to choose to be all those things that I promised to be when I agreed to get married, even though like he wasn't doing what I wanted him to do. Even
Hmm.
that, like under the most difficult circumstances, I had to choose to love him anyway. And I
Hmm.
had to choose to see the best in him. And I had to choose to have faith and hope and belief in our marriage, even though I was really hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, to take on that sense of obligation which is, that
Hmm.
tends to be a dirty word in sort of modern therapeutic parlance, but I don't think it's a dirty word, that sense
Hmm.
of commitment to something, and it
Yeah.
forces growth. And
Yeah, it
and
does.
of course, your story has a lovely, I don't want to say ending because it's still going on, but
Yeah.
a
But it
lovely
had a nice,
development.
a good outcome
Yeah.
from where it was.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that so many marriages just get to this place where like people can't like they cannot see a path on the way through.
Yeah.
And just having that faith and that hope, like, when I share my story, someone messaged me the other day and she said, just because you've shared your story and you talk and you gave me this faith when that I had no faith that this was ever possible.
Yeah.
And I
Mhm.
remember that too, just looking for anyone who'd done what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And when I saw, like, okay, some people have done this, this is possible, it gave me that hope, which
Mm,
carried me so much further
Yeah.
down
So
the line.
important.
yeah.
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 How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah. So my website is www.sophieorozco.com. That's got everything that you need to know there, every way to contact me and get in touch with me.
Great. And yeah, we'll make sure to put that in the notes from this
Hmm.
episode. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. Really nice to meet you both.
Nice
Thank
to meet
you.
you.
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed that interview and learned something from Sophie. And if you're having similar problems in your relationship, take a tip from Sophie.
Yeah, it is. It is possible for things to change. I love that notion because, it's not like everybody, and she's speaking to women. It's not like every woman who's in that situation will end up with her marriage being saved.
Right.
But what she pointed out, and I think it's really important, is you'll either end up with your marriage being saved or you'll end up with a better relationship with your ex-husband. But either
Exactly.
way, you will end up better yourself.
Yes.
That's what the growth part of this is all about. So many people have expressed gratitude
Mm-hmm.
for the growth that happens through a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, just the fact that it's possible to turn things around the way
Right?
she did,
Look at how she.
that is really
I was
inspiring.
very amazed by that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, she was really determined to do it, and by golly, she did it.
Yeah.
But it wasn't easy.
No.
She had to do a lot of work and a lot of work on herself. And
Yes.
good for her that she realized that, she was, it's a 50-50 proposition, and her 50% was,
Yeah, no,
and
she had to do an enormous amount of
yeah,
growth, and it takes strength and maturity,
it sure
and
does.
the faith part of our 7 words, be kind,
Mm-hmm.
don't panic, and have faith. The faith part is that you've got that in you, folks. You have that.
Mm-hmm.
It's available.
Yeah,
It's hard to find sometimes. It's difficult and that's true for everybody,
right.
but it's there.
And she
And
certainly was the embodiment of having faith throughout this
absolutely,
whole process. So, have faith. But
yes.
on another note, if you have a problem or if you have something that you would like us to talk about on our podcast, please go to our website, ctin7.com. That's CT as in couples therapy and the number 7.com. And you can write to us there, or you can suggest topics that you'd like us to discuss, or you yourself could be a guest on our podcast.
And you can even sign up for a time. There's a scheduling link there. And when you do that, we'll ask you what you want to talk about. So I hope you will do all that. I hope you'll also buy our books and tell folks about the books, of course. Love more reviews, by the way. Just throwing that in. Both of us, in our respective books, we want
Yes.
more reviews. And if you just rate the podcast and
Right. Like
share it
us,
and all that
follow
stuff.
us, share it, all that stuff that people do to make themselves known.
And so until next time,
Remember, be kind
don't panic.
and have faith.